Hi, everyone. Such a blessing to have so many people with us today. We're so happy to have you with us. And I am an Eastern Band Cherokee from Cherokee, North Carolina. And I'm excited and honored to welcome Sherry Salway Black as our first guest. Her biography is quite extensive. She's worked for more than 40 years with American Indian issues in the American Indian Policy Review Commission, the Indian Health Service, First Nations Development Institute, the National Congress of American Indians, and as a private consultant. She currently serves on the boards of directors of the Johnson Scholarship Foundation, the First Peoples Fund, Prosperity Now, and as a trustee for the newly formed Native American Agriculture Fund. She also serves on the Board of Trustees for the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And in 2011, Barack Obama appointed her to the President's Advisory Committee on Financial Capability. She has a Master's of Business Administration degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's degree from East Stroudsburg University, where in 2013 she received the Distinguished Alumni Award. In 2016, Ms. Black received a Special Distinguished Leadership Award from the National Congress of American Indians, and in 2019 received the John W. Gardner Leadership Award from the Independent Sector. She is Oglala, Lakota, and is originally from South Dakota. She and her husband, Ron Black, a citizen of the Seneca Nation, live in Falmouth, Virginia. So welcome, Sherry.
Of course, I forget to unmute myself, but thank you, Becky. I know. We've all done so many of these, but thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. It really is an honor for me to be with NICOA, to be an elder, a senior citizen, to have spent more than 45 years actually working in Native communities on development. So again, it's really an honor. It's an honor to see everyone here on the Zoom meeting.
Excellent. Well, let's go ahead, and what we're wanting to talk about is some of the work that you've been doing in your career. And so the first thing we'd like to ask is, how did you get involved in doing asset development work to help build Native economies in Indian country?
Long story, I'll try to shorten it, but part of it is, as we all know, probably everyone here on the call is affected by policies in Indian country. And I was born on Pine Ridge, I'm Oglala, Lakota, but I didn't grow up there. My mother was from Pennsylvania, met my dad as a nurse on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they moved back and forth in the 50s. This was with relocation and efforts around a lot of Indian country around termination. My dad had been in World War II, he was a veteran, and so they moved back and forth and finally settled in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. And when I graduated from college, I wanted nothing more to do than to go back to South Dakota, and that was in 1974. And so if folks remember what was happening in 1974, it was a lot of activism. The takeover of Wounded Knee was the year before. So it really was a wake-up call for me as to what was happening in Indian country. And again, we're all affected by these events that happen during our lives. And so that really led me to hook up with a cousin and come to Washington, D.C. in '76 to work for the American Indian Policy Review Commission. And that was the very last congressional commission that studied Native issues. And again, around a lot of activists from that time and really learning about kind of taking control of our own lives. Self-determination came in 1975, the Act, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. My background was in health education, so I got a job. I went to the Indian Health Service and started there, and they provided the support for my master's degree. And when you get that kind of support in your life, you have to pay it back. And that's really what I was doing with my career, is to want to work in Native communities. And I worked for the Indian Health Service. And again, folks, this was in the early 1980s, where there hadn't yet been a transition to Native people in management. I was one of the early folks at headquarters, but also the federal government was really still dominating Native communities. I was there working when Rosebud was the very first tribe to take over the planning of their hospital under a 638 contract. And so I was so much wanting to say yes to Native communities. Yes, you can do this. If you want to do this, you can do it. So I left the Indian Health Service and went to work for First Nations Development Institute in 1985. And that's what we did. We said yes to Native communities, where they had an idea what they wanted to do, and we did everything we could to try to help them do that. And so I worked there for 20 years. And that's when this graphic that you'll see at some point really talks about the focus of our work through assets in Indian country. And many of you know the Indian controlled school movement started in the 60s and went through the 70s and 80s, where, you had tribal colleges, the first one in 1968 or 69. You had schools on Navajo that were Indian controlled. So we were really starting to gain control of our institutions, and those are our assets. So that's sort of really what focused me on looking at control. So that was the first instance. So that was a long answer to your question.
You lived through some tumultuous events.
Yeah.
So that slide you mentioned, if we could share that, tell us about this slide and about the elements of development.
Sure. Well, this came out of the first decade of work at First Nations. And again, there's an article that Becky will provide the link to that goes with this. It was done in 1994, so it's somewhat out of date, but still very relevant, I think. Well, this was drawn from the work that Native communities were telling us, in essence, that assets are things that we value. A lot of folks will say, there's no Native word for assets, or, looking at it in strictly a financial way of looking at it, but we shouldn't, because it is things like our institutions. It's our children's education. So assets are things that we value. If you look at it in the financial sense, the economic sense, it is something that provides income. So assets provide income, like a business provides income. A house grows in value. So people tend to think of those as assets, but it's also our culture. It's our culture bearers. And that's why it's tied, these quadrants are important to kinship, in essence, that it really are ownership of assets and control of them is so important, whether it be our schools, our tribal governments. You began to see tribes taking over control, management of their governments in the 70s into the 80s, 90s, and so on. And, again, I could probably spend a couple hours going through the chart here, but just to recognize how important assets are. So there was a lot of work done in the early 1990s around rather than just look at income for people, like trying to increase our income, but it's also to look at assets, creating new assets like businesses, getting our land back, having a house, getting an education. All of those kinds of things are what we looked at as control of assets.
I can see there is a lot to look at and understand here. So this is just to scratch the surface of all this. Do you have any other comments about that, or do you want to move on? Or?
Well, I think in the sense of, if we talk about, I know we were looking at kind of cutting back on some of the questions here, but how that gets us into the wealth gap, if you wanted to follow up with that.
Sure. Yes. Help us understand. I first met you at a conference that's now called Prosperity Now, but back then it was called CFED. and was so impressed with the energy and diversity of that organization. And that's where the first time I heard the term racial wealth gap. And it'd be great to have your definition of that. And why do you think it's important for Indian people to understand it?
Right. So again, Prosperity Now, I serve on the board, has a biannual conference called the Prosperity Now Summit that they just had a few weeks ago. And they really focus on this racial wealth gap. Again, income only gets us so far. And we look at wealth, the accumulation of assets and assets that grow in value, like your house, again, like an education or a business, or if you have investments like a retirement plan. And what they have found is that there is a widening, it's not getting any better, gap between white population in the United States and people of color. Unfortunately, they don't have great data on Native wealth and that wealth gap, but they do for Black and Latino communities, they do, and they're showing this wealth gap to be significant, meaning I think the latest figures, and you can go to the Prosperity Now website, show that the average wealth accumulation in a white family is 117,000, but it's only like in the 50s and 60s for families of color. And the reason there's not, I think, good data on Native communities is the issue of the status of much of our land, of our housing, those types of things. So it's very difficult sometimes to put a value on that. So it's difficult. So there are some researchers now that are beginning to look at wealth in Native communities. If we go back to, talking about it from a tribal perspective, you can look at the development of assets over time in tribal communities, the casinos, the hotels, whatever your tribe is doing, those are producing income. They're for the tribe to support other kinds of things. And so those are assets. So again, because of the structure of Native communities and economy, sometimes it's difficult. We have to develop our own definitions, an understanding of the wealth in Native communities.
Okay. Given that information, what role do you think that the Native Community Development Financial Institutions, our Native CDFIs, play in asset development?
Right. Well, if folks aren't aware, there is such a thing as CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, and they were started by an act of Congress in 1994. And this is housed out of the Treasury Department. And probably in total in the whole country, and these are, they're not necessarily unregulated financial institutions, but they're able to do community development. They're not typically, as like banks, that type of thing. They're able to do the kind of lending for housing, for small business development, for land purchases that in communities of color, we have not had the kind of banking relationships that we should have. We're unbanked or we're underbanked. And so Native CDFIs, period, were to help poor and underserved communities be able to have access to credit and capital. And so starting in the 2000s, the Treasury program really helped to support Native ones. We started working on one in 1985, which became the Lakota funds, which was the first one in South Dakota. But now there are more than 70 certified Native CDFIs, and they provide support primarily for small business development, but there also are ones that are housing, to help people purchase housing, to help people start businesses, to help people purchase land. And again, those are helping us to save, some of them are helping us to save, and those are all the assets that are helping us to build our wealth. So these Native financial institutions are critical. They're critical infrastructure for capital. Unfortunately, they're not on every reservation. They're not in every community. but they are, again, more than 70. And there's probably a little over 1,000 total in the country. So we have a big portion of them, considering our population, that we have 70. And there are some in the pipeline that are still developing too.
They seem like a very feisty group too. I listen in on their Friday calls, and they're busy.
Right. So there's an entity called the Native CDFI Network, NCN, and they do have Friday calls if you want to check in on that too.
Well, we're doing great on time.
Okay.
Tell us about some of the exciting work you've been involved in since you've retired, as you seem as busy, if not busier, since you've retired. For example, the Johnson Scholarship Foundation, the Native American Agricultural Fund, Prosperity Now, and the First Peoples Fund.
Great. Well, Johnson Scholarship Foundation, I first became aware of them in the mid-1990s, and they are a private foundation, private family foundation, started by a man and his wife who was one of the original employees of UPS, Ted Johnson Sr. and his wife, Vivian. And they bought UPS stock. So when it went public, they had quite a bit of money. And Ted Johnson, in addition to two other focus areas, which are disadvantaged and disability, just really felt that American Indian people had gotten a raw deal, he said. So he really wanted to support education, because education can help people. So we now fund, for the past 20 plus years, Johnson has funded scholarships for Native American students studying business. And we do that through a variety of different strategies. With tribal colleges and universities, there are programs. With Native serving institutions, we started the MBA in American Indian Entrepreneurship at Gonzaga University, of which have had 70 Native students get their MBA through that program over the last 10 to 12 years. We just are setting up now a scholarship program at the American Indian Graduate Center for Native students in finance and accounting, undergraduate and graduate. We have a few endowments set up with the American Indian College Fund. So again, this focus on business and entrepreneurship in Indian country. So it's been very exciting to work with them. And the First Peoples Fund, that's the other one. I chair the board there, and if folks aren't aware, it's an organization, again, 25 years old. Lori Puyer is the CEO and president, and they focus working with Native artists and culture bearers throughout the country. And they have a number of different programs, grant programs for artists and business leadership, artist entrepreneurs. They have awards program, the Community Spirit Award, which is an annual award for Native that are nominated from their communities, culture bearers who continue the culture. So they really look at this creative economy and what's happening in, we all know what a high percentage of artistic people and culture bearers there are in Native communities. So the focus is on them. And Prosperity Now, as Becky has talked about, that's a national organization focused on looking at, again, some asset building strategies, but looking at this racial wealth divide and how can we make things more equitable in that through policy kinds of changes. And then the Native American Agriculture Fund, and many of you might be aware of the Keep Siegel lawsuit, which was settled during the Obama administration. It was a lawsuit by Native farmers and ranchers who proved that there was discrimination in credit programs through the USDA. And the lawsuit was settled, and after the claims were paid out, there was a remainder amount, and that was set up to be a private foundation, the Native American Agriculture Fund. And there were trustees who were appointed by the court in the settlement, and I was one of those. So I serve. We all have different terms in that. But we've since made $27 million in grants for Native food-related farmers and ranchers to support Native farmers and ranchers and fishers, and again, sort of this broad definition. And we really launched in 2018, so it's a little over 2 years, and we've done funding of $27 million. And we have a limited lifespan, 20 years, and then it goes out of. So we have to finish the work in 20 years. So, so that's it in a nutshell. It keeps me busy.
Wow. Okay. So everybody should make a note of those different organizations so they can check out if there's anything they qualify for.
Mm-hmm.
How can our organization, National Indian Council on Aging, and others, and the members play a part in building wealth in Indian country in the way that you mean, that broad sense that you mean?
Wow. So there are, there's so many. Again, that's sort of a whole different session that we could have. I would love to have that. I think, and again, to make it a little personal in this, I think about my mom and my dad and the kinds of lessons they gave me in, we were poor growing up, as many of us are, in the sense of budgeting and financial management, and being a role model, I think, for kids and grandkids in terms of being financially aware of what's happening, and how to look at securing, a future. I think in the sense of there are some great studies out there. If you want to read more about it, I put together a list of resources, which I'll send to Becky. For example, with First Nations, there are a great many studies there about financial capability, about so much of the work that they've done over the past 30 years. And then, so a lot of work being done recently on sort of looking at the narrative out there and looking at it changing the narrative about getting people to learn about and understand what's happening in Native communities. And that's part of it, is to say, hey, we are still here, the land is still here, and, we are a people kind of doing things. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an organization called Illuminative. And they just came out with a study very, very recently, like within the last month, that focuses on, they did a survey of 6,000 Native people, and it's really looking at Indigenous futures. And it talks about the recent election and who votes. And obviously, senior citizens vote at a higher rate, as others. And so I think there are so many different available resources to educate ourselves about some of the things that are happening out there in Indian country.
Thanks, Sherry.
Are we good on time?
Oh, yeah, I think so. There's so much of I think the things you're saying are so fascinating that we would really like to try and ask you back again, if we possibly can, maybe in the new year. We'll try to set something up so we can get into and dig into some of these topics more.
I'd love to do that.
That would be great. Jennifer, do you know if we have any questions from the listeners?
We don't, but if you do have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box, and we would be happy to pose them to Sherry.
I think everybody wants to get on with the exercises.
Well, dealing with these issues and thinking about these topics is a form of celebration, at least to me. So I think, here is a question. I'm going to go ahead, Jennifer, if it's okay. It says, how do we become more involved?
Well, I think, again, I would look to your location, in essence, your community, as to what is available in that area. And also, too, I think so many folks are, do you have to live on the reservation to apply for the agricultural fund? Well, it has to be an organization, no grants to individuals, or a tribe. So there are 4 different groups that we can provide funds to: nonprofit, educational institution, tribal government, or Native CDFI. And looking at the support for Native farmers and ranchers and food system kinds of things. But going back to the other one, I think a lot of folks are really connecting back with their tribes. And I know some tribes, hold open if you live in the city and don't live on your home reservation. I know there's ways to connect back to that. Also, different Native nonprofit organizations. I think you can connect with those as well. And there's a growing number of those.
Let's see. Darcy says, Quinana, for your service to Indian country, Elder Black, I'm re-strategizing our nonprofit into bridging homelessness to home ownership. Do you have any advice?
Again, I would, it's been a couple of years before I really was informed about what was happening specifically in the Native housing area. But I would encourage, if you know Native American Indian Housing Council, to go to that site. And then I don't know which, out of the 70 plus Native CDFIs, my guess would be maybe 10% of them are focused on housing, and to really look at some of the unique things that they are doing as well. I know there's one on Pine Ridge. I'm gonna have a memory lapse here on names and stuff, but yeah. So I think through that work too.
All right, let's see. How are things in your area with the pandemic? Valerie asks.
Valerie asks, yeah. So I live with my husband and I live in Virginia, and our rates are going up, not as quickly as other places, but I was on calls yesterday and whatever with friends and colleagues who work in South Dakota. And we all know, the stories of what's happening on Navajo and Hopi and those areas. So really, in North Dakota, I was on a call with some folks there from the Agricultural Council that it's really, really taking a toll, on Native folks there. And, again, it really is. This organization I mentioned, Illuminative, has a part of they did a COVID-19 survey in Indian country as part of that. And that's also on their website if you wanted to look like what is happening with COVID-19 in Indian country. And again, these are fairly recent documents. And also, I was on First Nations website too. They also have a report on it as well.
Okay. Darcy says, what are some specific ways CDFIs can help procure homes for so many of our homeless Native relations?
Again, I don't know specifics of the kind of programming they do, but they will work with people, as CDFIs do generally, on if somebody has really awful credit or a bad history, financial history. I would imagine even if they are homeless too, they work on repairing, they call it, your credit history. So that's, I know, one aspect of it. I don't know one specifically that are working on veterans, but there are ones that I've heard of in the past. I can't mention them right off that do work with veterans programs on the reservation too, with housing. Some work on home ownership, some work on being able to help people get deposits for rental. So it's not just owning a home, it's actually having a home, having a place to live too, that they work with. So.
Very good. Okay, now we are getting a little tight on time.
Okay.
But let's try and go through these quickly. Nicolette is asking, does the Ag Fund apply for co-ops that families start? What are the concepts? Example is today's agriculture is taking from the land, and I've learned that we need better soil recuperating. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So the four structures that we can fund are nonprofits, 501c3 organizations. So if a co-op is structured as a 501c3 organization, then yes, it could apply for funding. And educational institutions and Native CDFIs, and then tribal governments. So that category 501c3 nonprofits is very, very broad. Native controlled, focus on those areas as well. So,
All right. So people can go to the websites and learn more, I'm sure, about those different.
right, Native Agriculture, Native American Agriculture Fund, NAF, to go to that website for sure.
And then Mary Jo Hunter, who is also an ICOA board member, is asking or making a comment. President-elect Biden has a plan for Native Americans. Have you seen any benefits for our community in his plan?
I have not seen it yet. I've known a couple of people who were working on it, who I've worked with over time. So, again, having been in the Obama administration, which there was quite a bit of focus on tribes and Native communities. In fact, if you look at all of the claim settlements that were done under Obama, I would assume, I shouldn't say that. I should look at the plan and comment on it, and I haven't seen it, but just because of that history in common. And if you look now, I mean, boy, what did I just read? 3 Native women now in Congress. I think it's 3 or 4 that were just elected in this past. I think New Mexico has one, Deb Holland. So I think there are 3 in total now that are in Congress. So I think in terms of a new administration and a new Congress, we can look to those folks as well.
Sherry, it's just scratching the surface of all the things that we'd love to talk about with you. And thank you so much for all your wisdom and the work you've done over your career. And I hope we can do this again very soon.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to stay on for a little bit and benefit from the rest of the stuff. So I might have to leave at some point, but I'll be on for a bit.
It's been my honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.